My favorite part of being a dungeon master is the NPCs. Creating them, role-playing them, watching my players decide if they trust them or fear them or find them annoying. I love NPCs. You're probably thinking, Ginny, if you love NPCs so much, why don't you marry them? Well, guess what? I did. Anyway, sometimes I love NPCs a little too much. No, I'm not talking about the marriage. I don't regret that. It was a beautiful ceremony. I'm talking about this sidebar in the new 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, undoubtedly written to attack me specifically. Don't go overboard. Developing non-player characters can be fun. That said, use your time wisely. Beware of writing 3 pages of backstory for an NPC whose interactions with the adventurers will be over in 3 minutes. There's an NPC spectrum, and both extremes are a problem. On one end are NPCs so detailed that they're venturing into protagonist territory. On the other end are NPCs so forgettable that they might as well be cardboard cutouts. So how do we make sure our NPCs feel interesting and unique but don't steal the show? Somebody should probably make a video about that. Oh, me? Well, if you insist. As a D&D 5th edition player, I am now blessed with not 1, but 2 Dungeon Master's Guides, and that means that whenever I don't like what one of them says, I can get a second opinion. But in this case, I like bits and pieces of both of them, so let's take a quick look at what they have to offer us when it comes to NPCs. Right up front, both books agree that NPCs only need stat blocks if you have reason to believe they'll be involved in combat, and that 1 or 2 notable characteristics are usually enough to make a passing NPC feel unique. For example, if your players talk with 2 town guards, your world will feel a little more real, and the scene will be a little more fun if, I don't know, one of them keeps sneezing and the other seems annoyed by it. Paylor's mercy, man, at least cover your mouth. But if your players are anything like mine, every random passing NPC has a good chance of becoming a more detailed NPC if the party decides to latch onto them. And it's with these more detailed NPCs that the 2 books diverge. In the 2014 DM's Guide, they lay out a 10-point to-do list for creating memorable NPCs. I know that's a long list, and I am gonna go through the whole thing, so hang on a sec while I grab a cat for viewer retention. Okay, here's Pablo Picasso, and here's the list. Occupation and history, appearance, abilities, talent, mannerism, interactions with others, useful knowledge, ideal, bond, flaw, or secret. Occupation and history could mean they're a beggar from a fallen noble house, or a guard who used to be an adventurer like you until, well, you know. Appearance is a visual detail, like a tattoo or weird hat. Abilities are especially high or low skills, like a bodyguard with high strength and low intelligence, probably voiced by Patrick Warburton. If I had a nickel for every time that's happened, I'd only have 2 nickels, but it is weird that it happened twice. Talent is whatever they'd put on their dating profile. Stuff like expert cook or good with children. Mannerisms are quirks like speaking loudly or biting their fingernails. Interactions are attitudes like argumentative or curious. Useful knowledge is just what they can tell the party. And finally, ideals, bonds, and flaws, just like player characters got in 2014, except now flaws also include secrets. I love a detailed NPC, but to me, this is a bit excessive. A lot of these points could be combined, and I don't think every NPC, even an important one, needs this whole list. Like, not everyone has a talent. Some of us are just here taking up space, and we deserve representation too. Oh. Sorry, it's time for his union-mandated 10-hour nap. Plus, name and stat block aren't even on this list, so really you have a 12-point to-do list, which is a heck of a choice for a book that specifically lectures against making NPCs more than just bit players. And the game designers must have agreed with me, because the 2024 DM's Guide has cut this list down to just 6 points. Name, stat block, alignment, personality, appearance, and secret. There's a full page of rolling tables for names now, which is great, since my brain is only capable of generating 2 names under pressure: Cragnock the Skull Crusher or Susan. Then you pick a stat block and an alignment. The updated books are very into alignment all of a sudden. And then it's time for personality. The personality section points you to the player's handbook, where you can choose or randomly generate traits based on their alignment and ability scores. I found this feature very underwhelming for player characters, but I actually think it's perfect for NPCs. Let's say you've got a pirate captain. Her alignment is neutral, so the rolling table in the PHB gives us disinterested. Her highest stat is dexterity, which gives us fidgety, and her lowest stat is intelligence, so maybe she's frivolous. So now we have a pirate who loves the action and the gold, but has the attention span of a highly caffeinated goldfish. She'll take a bribe without batting an eye, and if your players try to give her a dramatic speech, she'll be halfway through looting their ship before they can get to paragraph 2. To me, this method is even more effective than the rolling tables in 2014, because it's specific to the NPC. Next on the list is appearance, which has an abbreviated version of the same rolling table from 2014, and finally, a secret. And And look, secrets are great, but I really don't think every NPC needs to be hiding something. If everyone has a skeleton in their closet, your players are gonna be opening closets like, wow, another skeleton. Shocking. If you're wondering which of these two checklists I use for my NPCs, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't use either. Making lists is my favorite hobby, so I wasn't about to let the game designers have all the fun. I think most experienced DMs are like me and have their own personal NPC checklist, whether they've written it down or they just keep it in their head. The more NPCs you create and use in games, the more you figure out what's actually useful to you and what's just busy work. For example, I find that NPC motivation is much more valuable to me than history. Sure, some characters benefit from a little backstory. If I've written the aging elf matriarch so the players can ask her about history, then it's important to know her history. But for 9 out of 10 NPCs at my table, their past just doesn't come up. My players are way more likely to ask a random shopkeeper what their favorite color is than where they were born, and honestly, I respect that. But an NPC's motivation can shape their behavior in a million little ways, even if players never actually learn what that motivation is. If the shopkeep has 3 children to support, she may be constantly exhausted and frazzled, hesitant to give discounts, or sympathetic to players who mention family. If the necromancer is only raising the dead to prove a point to his in-laws, he might be super defensive about his work. Oh, necromancy isn't a real job? Let's see how you feel next time you need a corpse raised, Peter. In a minute, I'll share my patented, copyrighted, trademarked, and totally official NPC checklist. You don't technically have the clearance for it, but I'll make an exception. Right after today's sponsor. The case was cold, colder than a necromancer's handshake. My campaign notes were a mess. Maps scattered, NPCs lost in the margins. I needed a system, but I was drowning in a sea of half-finished ideas and I'd forgotten to prep water breathing. Still struggling, detective? You should have called me sooner. Winona World Anvil, a toolkit for writers, game masters, and world builders. Rumor has it she could inventory a dragon's hoard and still make it home in time for dinner. I've used your tools before, Anvil. The wiki-style articles, the interactive nestable maps and stat blocks, even the family trees and historical timelines. But this is a snarl even you couldn't untangle. That's because you haven't seen the new article editor. Our visual editor lets you see exactly what your articles will look like. Formatting updates in real time, drag and drop images. No more BB code, no more mess, no more excuses. It was almost too easy, like winning an arm wrestling contest with a wizard, but I wasn't about to look a gift mimic in the mouth. All right, Anvil, you've got my attention. Does the code Ginny still get me 51% off any annual membership? It does. But be careful, detective. You start getting organized and people might mistake you for a respectable dungeon master. The job wasn't done, not yet, but a DM's work never is. You know, sponsorship money is nice, but the real reward is the chance to make a miniature film noir. Anyway, back to my NPC checklist. My version looks something like this. Name, stat block / role, appearance, personality, motivation. For example, take Tussock Frostfur, an NPC in an adventure I'm working on. He doesn't have a stat block because he's really not a fighter. His deadliest weapon is an enthusiastic lecture on gear ratios, but his role is that he's the engineer for a Fey-built train. He's a fairy, but he hasn't sprouted his wings yet, so he's stout, caterpillar-like, and covered in bristly blue fur. He's got 16 limbs, and they're usually all doing different things. His personality is that he has a curious mind, and he's a total nerd for tinkering and problem solving. Motivation? Workaholic. He loves his job so much, I wouldn't be surprised if he has a live, laugh, locomotive throw pillow at home. With this list of 5 things, I could roleplay Tussock Frostfur for an hour. Not that anybody would want that, but I could. If you haven't developed your own NPC checklist yet, I would suggest starting with someone else's list, whether that's one of the lists from the DMG, or mine, or something you Frankenstein together from several Reddit posts, and just pay attention to how it works for you. Are you over-prepared, where certain things on the list just never come up, or do you feel under-prepared? And if so, what are you missing? Over time, you'll learn what your list actually needs. After presenting their version of the NPC checklist, each Dungeon Master's Guide starts talking about another really important thing to consider, NPC roles. Well, first, the 2014 DMG gets into stat block options, including the casual suggestion of using full character sheets for NPCs. I don't know about you, but every time I run a climactic combat, I think this would be so much more fun if I had to flip through 3 pages of class features every time my big bad takes a turn. Thank God they stopped suggesting that in the 2024 book. But this video is about NPCs as a narrative tool, so I am not gonna spend 5 full minutes ranting about stat blocks versus character sheets. is what I should have told myself before writing a 500-word rant that I had to delete. The 2014 guide goes over 5 different roles that NPCs can fill. 3 of these roles are pretty simple and self-explanatory: hirelings, contacts, and extras, aka any random NPC that you basically just mention as set decoration. Not really sure why they gave that a full 3 paragraphs, since the only advice they offer is watch out DMs, if your players talk to them, you might have to make stuff up. Ah, my greatest weakness. None of those 3 roles are given much space in the 2024 guide. Instead, there's just a short passage called Recurring NPCs that briefly mentions allies, patrons, friends, or villains. Yeah, shockingly, that's pretty much all the 2024 DM's guide says about villains, which is wild because villains can be central to a campaign. The 2014 guide gave them 3.5 pages, including rolling tables for their schemes, methods, and weaknesses, and 2 villainous class options: the Death Domain Cleric and the Oathbreaker Paladin. So if you want literally any guidance on creating and roleplaying a villain, I guess you're headed back to 2014. Just make sure not to tell past you what's coming. You and I both know they couldn't handle it. One role both books cover in detail is NPC party members. Now, this can be a touchy subject thanks to the infamous DMPC. This is where the Dungeon Master has their own player character. DMPCs have a bad reputation because when done poorly, they steal the spotlight, always have the right answers, and basically become a perfect all-knowing hero, which makes sense since they're played by the one person who literally knows everything. At that point, you might as well just print out a certificate that says World's Best Adventurer and present it to yourself. But whether you love him or hate him, an NPC joining the adventuring party does not magically make them a DMPC. Both DMGs list solid reasons for NPC party members, although the perspective has clearly shifted over the last decade. In 2014, it's suggested that low-level followers might be good backup characters in case a PC retires or dies, and that NPCs with full-on character sheets can fill in gaps in party composition. By the time we hit the 2024 book, there's no more mention of full character sheets, and nobody's pretending a player would rather adopt an NPC than create a new character of their own. Instead, there's a list of suggested archetypes to help you support the party without overshadowing them. Everything from the dutiful assistant to the comic relief. Either way, both books include optional loyalty rules for deciding how far NPCs will go for the party and warnings about taking up too much space, which is good because no one wants to be upstaged by Susan the Milquetoast Healer. Personally, I don't find it that useful to sort NPCs into buckets based on their relationship to the players. Not all contacts or hirelings or even villains will have the same level of depth. Sometimes my players meet a shopkeep, buy what they need, and move on with their lives. Other times, they decide that it is their personal mission to help this shopkeep achieve their lifelong dream of a solo music career. That's why I think of NPCs more in terms of their scale than their role, and that scale is not set in stone. With the exception of a character that I know from the jump is going to be super important, like a big bad, I try to assume that every NPC is a small-scale character until my players show me otherwise. This helps me avoid pushing an NPC into the spotlight just because I want to justify how much time I spent prepping them. That means that until I get a feel for whether or not my players are even interested in Tussock Frostfur, I don't worry about anything other than those 5 sentences I shared before. You would be shocked how effectively that short checklist will provide the illusion of depth with just a few minutes of work. If the character ends up becoming more important, I can flesh them out from there, and my players never need to know that Tussock didn't even have a secret until one of them said, "I don't trust that caterpillar guy, he seems shady." Basically, I let the players decide how important they want each NPC to be. Not only does this mean I'm less likely to waste time on NPCs that players aren't interested in learning more about, it also keeps my expectations low, because every DM eventually experiences the heartbreak of players hating their cool self-insert and loving the goblin that you named Greg as a joke. There's a lot of good stuff in these books, but there's one thing that neither of them covers, and that is how your players feel about your NPCs. As DMs, we often create characters with the intention of them being likable or hateful, trustworthy or suspicious, funny or tragic, and when our players don't get that memo, it can be frustrating, and sometimes even affect the path of the adventure. Obviously, you can't control what your players think. I mean, I can, but I'm an illithid wearing an extremely realistic human suit, so I'm an exception. But there are a few steps you can take to nudge your party in the right direction. I've mentioned the book Save the Cat in videos before. It's a famous screenwriting book, and it's even included in the list of recommended reading at the end of the 2014 DM's guide. The title of the book comes from a simple strategy that screenwriters use to get the audience to like the protagonist. They show them doing something kind. This doesn't mean that your NPC has to heroically rescue a child from a runaway horse reverse while a single tear rolls down their cheek in order to show that they have a good heart. Instead, maybe the gruff, surly blacksmith catches the spider and releases it outside instead of squishing it. Maybe the tavern keep quietly refills a hungry patron's bowl without charging them. Maybe the noble knight shows the child with a wooden sword how to take the right stance. If you want to communicate that a character is bad, then you can just do the reverse. The blacksmith catches a rat in his shop and tosses it into the forge to burn it alive. The tavern keep shoos a beggar onto the street, telling them that they're driving away customers. The knight yells at the children playing with wooden swords to get out of the way. Some knights slay dragons, some uphold the law, and some see children playing and think, not on my watch. Or how about this one, a classic real-life advice disguised as D&D advice tip. There's this phrase, being interested is interesting. Basically, if you want someone to like you, try liking them. Listen to what they say, ask questions, and care about their answers. Everybody likes feeling heard, and this works just as well when it's happening through the lens of fictional characters. That said, be careful not to overdo it. Your players will notice if you're laying it on too thick, and it'll make them suspicious. If your NPC is a little too interested, they might start to worry that they're a spy, or even worse, a bard. Flip this one on its head to make a character that everybody will hate. Yawn and get distracted when the PCs are talking, interrupt them to talk about something else. Get a character's name wrong a couple times, and congratulations, you've just created a campaign-long nemesis. That's actually why I always carry a sword. For people who spell Ginny with an I at the end. You know better than anyone what your players will like. Some like to be buttered up, while others inherently mistrust anyone who's nice to them. Some would die to protect a weird little guy that others would find obnoxious. Most of you probably clicked on this video because you like me, but some of you are hate watching and have probably imagined lighting this stupid blue hair on fire. Everybody has different tastes. If you know what your players care about, you can tap into it, whether for good or for evil. I know that my players will instantly love a himbo blacksmith who likes to bake, and I also know that they'll instantly hate anyone who invents fantasy cryptocurrency. One popular tip for making players really hate a villain is to take something they love away from them, such as an important or valuable item, or a beloved NPC or pet. And while this can be very effective, my suggestion is to avoid doing anything permanent here. A character who loses everything doesn't usually get more invested. If you kill their mom or destroy their magic sword, sure, they'll be mad, but now it's just vengeance. That's how a new murder hobo gets its wings. At that point, the villain has nothing left to threaten except death. But if mom gets kidnapped or the sword gets stolen, now they're driven to get it back. The villain has leverage, the stakes stay high, and your players have to think before charging in. It's also worth noting that you can use descriptions to communicate information too. Show, don't tell is good writing advice, but a DM already has to do 10 jobs in a trench coat. It's okay to take some shortcuts. There's no reason that you can't say something like, you get the impression that she looks down on the people of this village, or you can tell that he loves his daughter very much. Even with all those tactics, in the end, you can't control how your players will feel about your NPCs. That's why my best tip isn't saving a cat or being interested, it's just letting go. Try not to fall so in love with your NPCs that you'll be upset if players mock them or attack them or don't like them. That's why I keep my emotional investment strictly at a casual level. You know, like marriage. If worst comes to worst, you can always pivot. Let's say you prepped a bunch of detailed information for the barmaid, who is supposed to become an important resource, and the players completely ignore her in favor of the drunk old man throwing up outside the tavern. Well, I guess it's the old man who has all that information now, once he sobers up, that is. If you struggle with NPCs, there are tons of tools out there that have been created specifically to make this part of DMing easier. Books of NPCs, random tables, online generators, and don't get me wrong, I think those things can be really useful. But I also think that learning to whip up NPCs on the fly is an exercise that every DM can benefit from. Creativity is a muscle, and the more you work it out, the stronger it gets. At first, your NPCs might be weak and underdeveloped, but keep at it, and soon they'll be absolutely rippling with personality. And if you, like me, struggle to keep your NPC creation in check, trust me, I get it. I still go overboard. I have NPCs detailed enough to fill a novel, but as long as you're not forcing them into the spotlight and you can handle your players ignoring them, I don't think there's anything truly wrong with that. If my players encounter Wisteria the wizard student, they might never realize that she faces tremendous pressure from her parents, or that she's my self-insert neurodivergent character desperately trying to brute force her way through her symptoms, or that her family's wealth comes from the invention of a magical energy beverage called Apple Dackle's All-Nighter Cider. But boy, if it ever comes up, I'm so ready. If you want more DM tips, go ahead and smite that subscribe button because according to my analytics, more than 60% of you haven't done that yet. I also answer your tabletop questions and send out quick tips in my monthly email newsletter. If your inbox is anything like mine, it is a cursed wasteland of misery, but if you give me a chance, I'd love to make it just a little bit more fun. I'll put the sign up link in the description.